I pay all the taxes that are legally required and not a dollar more. I don't think you want someone as the candidate for president who pays more taxes than he owes.
Mitt Romney's philosophy on taxes. Of course, there's a lot we don't know about Romney's taxes because he's only released 2 years of his returns, and the controversy over his time at Bain is only adding to the confusion. It's why the Obama campaign is renewing its call for him to release his tax returns.
Walk through exactly when he did cut ties with Bain Capital. If the SEC filings aren't accurate, then prove it. If he wasn't investing millions of dollars in shell corporations, tax havens, Swiss bank accounts overseas to gain a tax advantage, then prove it. Prove it by releasing your tax returns.
This morning, former President Bill Clinton also said Romney needs to be more transparent.
All your work life before you run for president is relevant, and I think that will be relevant. I am a little surprised that he only released a year's worth of tax returns. That's kind of perplexed me. The public ought to know that. The voters can make up their own mind about whether they think it's a good thing to, for a person who wants to be president to minimize his own tax liability by putting the money in overseas tax shelters.
Now even Republicans are starting to worry that his leadership at Bain is backfiring. Some are also calling for him to release more tax returns. At the very least, seeing more of Romney's financial records would shed some light on his overseas investment in places like Bermuda, Switzerland, and the Cayman Islands. Of course, this lack of transparency isn't new for the Romney campaign. Back in 2002, when Romney was running for governor, a campaign aide responded to questions about his taxes during those missing Bain years by saying, quote, "You're just going to have to take my word for it." Joining me now is Pulitzer Prize-winning writer David K. Johnston. He's a columnist for Reuters and author of the book Perfectly Legal: The Covert Campaign to Rig Our Tax System to Benefit the Super Rich and Cheat Everyone Else. And Jonathan Capehart, an opinion writer for The Washington Post and an MSNBC contributor. Thank you both for being here tonight.
Thanks, Ray.
David, let me start with you. Should voters just take Romney at his word that he always paid his taxes and hasn't hidden any money in offshore tax shelters?
No, and why should voters be treated less well than John McCain? During the 2008 campaign, Romney was one of the potential vice presidential nominees, and John McCain's people got to vet his tax returns back to 1984, which is what I've been calling on Romney to release. If he's willing to give them to John McCain, who passed on him, by the way, for Sarah Palin, which does raise the question of was there something McCain saw in those tax returns? Yes, I think the American people should see those returns.
Now, Jonathan, it is interesting that when you look at the fact that presidential candidates, President Obama released 12 years, George W. Bush, 8 years, George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, when he ran for president, he released 12 years. Mitt Romney, only 2 years. So it's not like this is not something that isn't done. Even in primaries, all of us that have run have had to release returns and go through whatever the questions there were. So the question here is of transparency and of whether or not, as former President Clinton raised, did you use foreign tax places or havens to hide your taxes?
Well, Rev, what you left out in that litany of the presidents and presidential candidates who've released their tax returns, yes, George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, when he ran in the 1968 election, but in 1967, when he released his tax returns, it's George Romney who set the precedent of candidates releasing their actual tax returns. Before him, candidates would put out statements giving general views of where their financial holdings and their tax liabilities and things. But George Romney thought it was important to hand over 12 years of actual tax returns so that folks would know that, quote, it wasn't a fluke, but also so to make sure that people understood that the wealth, that he wasn't just showing off where the money came from. Mitt Romney is not following the lead set by his own father, one. And the second point here is, you know, the American people ought to know and need to know, as David just said, where a candidate, a potential president of the United States, earns his money, how he maintains his family. And the idea that Mitt Romney thinks he can get away with one full year of tax returns. And remember, the 2011 tax returns he's released are only estimates. And that's why President Clinton said in that interview with Savannah Guthrie today that Mitt Romney has only released 1 year. It's not acceptable.
Now, let me ask you, David, what is the purpose of having these offshore accounts? Are they set up because you heard Mitt Romney say that he's paid all of the taxes that was owed, not $1 more. So are these offshore accounts legal, but you're able to avoid taxes? I mean, what is the purpose of having them?
Well, there are offshore accounts which are legal and illegal, and there are accounts which allow you to avoid taxes and accounts that do not. At least some of his accounts are because American nonprofits investing in Bain's investments and foreign investors go through a Cayman Islands company to avoid filing an American tax return for the foreigners and paying taxes if they're nonprofits. And Romney gets carried interest, a share of the profits from that. But there are these other disturbing things. He set up a number of companies named for a lighthouse over in Bermuda. He had a Swiss bank account, and it's perfectly reasonable to question, well, what else did you do during the years from 1984 until now to avoid taxes or delay them?
Now, Jonathan, David Corner of Mother Jones reports that Bain, under Romney, outsourced to China. Let me read from the article. Romney, when he was in charge of Bain, invested heavily in Chinese manufacturing company that depended on U.S. outsourcing for its profits. This runs contrary to what Romney is saying and what he is campaigning on.
Yeah, Reb, there's something very important here. The reason why Mitt Romney gave these round-robin interviews to 5 networks, as you said at the top of the show, is because we need to go back to when the Obama campaign started making these attacks on Mitt Romney about outsourcing and about his tenure at Bain Capital. And the criticism the president and his campaign was getting for, blaming venture capital. Remember, you had Newark Mayor Cory Booker criticizing the president and other high-profile Democrats criticizing the president. Right. And I would submit that the reason why Mitt Romney is giving those interviews today, the reason why that story in the Boston Globe yesterday has gained so much traction is because the Obama campaign basically, through those attacks a couple of months ago, seeded the ground where that Boston Globe story yesterday made it sort of fundamental that Mitt Romney step forward and give some answers to those attacks and to that Boston Globe story. And from what I've seen so far, Mitt Romney isn't answering the question.
Well, I think you're right. I think it also, if you recall, they said that the administration was anti-private equity, even anti-capitalism. Right. Now it looks like clearly it's about Mitt Romney's business dealings, not a whole broad stroke at a whole industry or a broad attack on capitalism. But David K. Johnston, Jonathan Capewart, thank you both for your time tonight.
Thanks, Reb.
Coming up, Mitt Romney breaks his silence on the avalanche of controversy surrounding his time at Bain Capital, and he's making news on his tax returns. That's coming up. Stay with us.